The fluorescent lights of Riverside Mall hummed with that particular frequency that only comes from a building built in the early 70s, retrofitted in the 80s, and left to decay slowly into the 90s. It was November 14th, 1998, a Saturday afternoon when the mall was packed with early Christmas shoppers, teenagers loitering near the arcade, and families trying to make the most of a cold weekend in suburban Pennsylvania. The Holloway family had driven 40 minutes from their farmhouse outside of Millerton specifically for this trip. Daniel Holloway, age 9, had been saving his allowance for 3 months to buy a specific video game he'd seen advertised on television. His parents, Robert and Catherine, had promised him this outing if he kept his grades up, and Daniel had delivered straight B's on his last report card. For a kid who struggled with reading comprehension, those B's meant everything. Catherine remembered the outfit Daniel wore that day with the kind of clarity that trauma burns into memory. Blue jeans with a grass stain on the left knee from recess 2 days prior, and a red windbreaker with white stripes down the sleeves, white sneakers that lit up when he walked, the kind that made him feel fast, invincible. His brown hair was getting long, touching his collar, and Catherine had made a mental note to schedule a haircut for the following week. The mall was a sprawling single-story complex with 3 anchor stores and dozens of smaller shops connecting them like beads on a string. The Holloways entered through the west entrance near Sears, Daniel practically vibrating with excitement. Robert held his son's hand as they navigated through the perfume fog of the department store cosmetics section, Catherine trailing slightly behind, her purse clutched close as she mentally calculated their budget for the day. Gamer Zone was located in the central corridor, sandwiched between a cookie shop and a store selling nature posters and blacklight decorations. The gaming store was predictably packed with kids and their parents, the air thick with the electronic beeps and synthetic music of demo stations running the latest releases. Daniel made a beeline for the PlayStation section, his eyes scanning the wall of games with the intensity of a jewel thief casing a vault. Robert and Catherine gave him space to browse, standing near the entrance where they could keep an eye on him while also staying out of the crush of bodies. The store was maybe 30 feet deep, not large, impossibly crowded. Daniel was visible, then he wasn't, then he was again, his red jacket appearing and disappearing between other shoppers like a boat bobbing in rough water. Catherine glanced at her watch. 2:47 in the afternoon. She remembers this, because she was calculating how much time they had before needing to head back. Robert's mother was coming for dinner at 6:30, and Catherine still needed to prepare the green bean casserole. When she looked back up, she couldn't see the red jacket anymore. This wasn't immediately alarming. The store was packed. The kids moved around. Catherine took a few steps forward, craning her neck to see over a display of racing games. Robert had wandered to the counter, asking the clerk a question about trade in values. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. These 30 seconds passed. Maybe a minute. Catherine walked deeper into the store, her eyes scanning systematically now, left to right, up and down each aisle. No red jacket, no brown hair, no light-up sneakers. The first flutter of panic hit her chest like a bird trapped behind her ribs. She called his name. Not loud, not yet, just loud enough to be heard over the noise. Daniel, then again, sharper, Daniel. And several people turned to look at her. Robert heard the tone in her voice and immediately moved to her side, his face already shifting from casual to concerned. "Where is he?" Robert asked, his voice low but urgent. Catherine shook her head, unable to form words, her throat suddenly tight. They split up, Robert heading toward the back of the store, Catherine moving up each aisle with increasing desperation. She asked other shoppers, "Have you seen a boy in a red jacket? Brown hair? 9 years old?" Most shook their heads. One woman thought she'd seen a kid matching that description head toward the front of the store, maybe 5 minutes ago. 5 minutes. Had it been 5 minutes? Catherine's sense of time was already warping, stretching and compressing like taffy. Robert reached the back emergency exit. It was closed, but not locked. A sign warned that opening it would trigger an alarm. He pushed it open anyway. The alarm shrieked through the mall, adding to the chaos, the fear, the unreality of what was happening. The door led to a service corridor, concrete and dim, smelling of old cardboard and mildew. Empty. Robert ran down the corridor anyway, calling Daniel's name, his voice echoing off cinder block walls. Catherine was at the front counter now, grabbing the clerk, a teenager with acne and a name tag that read Tyler, practically shaking him. "My son is missing, call security, call someone now." Tyler fumbled for the phone, his hands trembling, completely unprepared for this level of emergency. Mall security arrived within minutes. 2 guards, one in his 50s with a gut and a wheezing problem, the other younger, trying to project authority he didn't quite possess. They took descriptions, asked questions, radioed for additional help. Robert provided a photo from his wallet, a school picture from September where Daniel smiled with a gap where his front tooth used to be. The mall went into lockdown protocol. Announcements over the PA system. All exits monitored. Staff at every store showing Daniel's photo. Catherine stood in the center of the corridor, turning in slow circles, her mind refusing to accept what was happening. This didn't happen here. This didn't happen to them. They were careful. They were good parents. Daniel knew not to talk to strangers. He knew to stay close. Police arrived at 3:32. Catherine would later remember the exact time because she kept checking her watch, as if time itself could reverse, could give her back those missing minutes. Detective Linda Torres took point, a woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes and a calm voice that somehow made everything worse because it meant this was routine for her. This happened enough that she had a procedure for it. The first hour was critical, Torres explained. Children who wandered off were usually found quickly, scared but unharmed. The mall wasn't that big. They'd find him. Except they didn't. By 5 o'clock, every store had been searched twice. Every bathroom, every storage room, every service corridor. K9 units arrived, German shepherds trained in tracking, but the scent trails went cold at the west parking lot, near a row of dumpsters behind the food court. That detail would haunt Robert for years. The dogs losing the scent near the dumpsters, as if Daniel had simply vanished into the November air. The mall remained on lockdown until 8 that night. Television news crews set up in the parking lot, their lights cutting through the darkness like searchlights at a prison. Catherine did an interview, her face pale and drawn, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Robert stood beside her, unable to speak, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. The investigation that followed was extensive, thorough, and ultimately fruitless. Every employee at the mall was interviewed and cleared. Security footage from that day was pulled and analyzed frame by frame. The cameras, old and grainy, had blind spots throughout the mall. The game zone itself had no internal cameras, a cost-cutting measure that would later result in a lawsuit the store's parent company quietly settled. The footage showed Daniel entering game zone at 2:43. He never appeared leaving through the front entrance. The rear emergency exit had no camera coverage. The service corridors were a maze of blind spots. Investigators theorized that someone had grabbed Daniel, moved quickly through the back corridors, and exited through one of several unsecured doors that led directly to the parking areas. But who? And why Daniel? In the weeks that followed, the Holloway's lives became a nightmare of police briefings, media interviews, and vigils. Volunteers searched the surrounding woods and farmland. Divers checked nearby ponds and streams. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the county. Daniel's face appeared on milk cartons, on flyers stapled to every telephone pole within 50 miles, on the evening news. Tips flooded in. A boy matching Daniel's description was seen at a rest stop 3 states away. Another sighting at a grocery store in Ohio. All false leads. All dead ends. The investigation consumed hundreds of man-hours, but as winter turned to spring and spring to summer, the trail grew cold. Detective Torres worked the case for 3 years before being reassigned. She never stopped thinking about Daniel Holloway, the boy in the red jacket who disappeared in broad daylight from a crowded mall. She kept the case file on her desk long after it was officially moved to the cold case archives. Robert and Catherine's marriage barely survived the first 5 years. Grief does strange things to people, twists them in ways they don't expect. Robert threw himself into work, spending 14-hour days at the manufacturing plant where he supervised a production line. Catherine couldn't work, couldn't function. She'd drive to the mall sometimes, just sit in the parking lot staring at the entrance, trying to understand how the universe could allow such a thing. They stayed in the farmhouse. Catherine refused to move, convinced that Daniel would find his way home someday and he'd need them to be there, waiting. His room remained exactly as he'd left it that Saturday morning. The bed made, though not well. Posters of dinosaurs and race cars on the walls. His backpack hanging on a hook by the door. Years passed with the particular cruelty that time has for the grieving. Birthdays came and went, each one marked by a cake Catherine baked but no one ate. Daniel would have been 10, 11, 12, and a teenager. Not he. Each milestone felt like a fresh wound. In 2003, a registered sex offender living 12 miles from the mall committed suicide, and in his possessions, at least found photographs of children taken at various public places. Daniel's face wasn't among them, but for a brief moment, Catherine allowed herself to hope for closure, even the worst kind. And that hope died when the man's timeline and known movements placed him out of state on November 14, 1998. The 20th anniversary of Daniel's disappearance came and went in 2018 with a small ceremony at the local church and a renewed media push. By then, Catherine and Robert were in their 60s, worn down by 2 decades of wandering. The case remained officially open but practically abandoned. No new leads, no breaks, just the endless, grinding question of what happened. And then on a Thursday afternoon in March 2019, Catherine was at the grocery store in Millerton, loading bags into her car, when she noticed a bulletin board near the entrance. The usual clutter of community announcements, business cards, event flyers. Her eye caught on one flyer in particular, pale blue paper, black text, New Beginnings Recovery Center, helping men rebuild their lives. Open house, Saturday, March 23rd. Below the text were 3 photographs of men, presumably success stories from the program. They were arranged in a row, smiling, looking healthy and hopeful. The man on the right was in his late 20s, dark hair, strong jawline, a small scar above his left eyebrow. Catherine's vision tunneled. The parking lot seemed to tilt. She grabbed the car to steady herself, her groceries forgotten. She knew that face. She knew that scar. Daniel had gotten that scar when he was 6, falling off his bike, splitting his eyebrow open on the handlebar. 4 stitches. A visit to the emergency room. Robert had carried him inside while Catherine filled out paperwork. Her hands shook as she pulled the flyer down from the board, holding it close, studying every detail of the photograph. The shape of the nose, the set of the eyes, the way his smile didn't quite reach those eyes, as if smiling was something he'd had to learn rather than something that came naturally. It was him, 20 years older, alive, at a rehab center. And mine. Catherine sat in her car for 20 minutes, unable to process what she was seeing. And the rational part of her brain whispered caution. 20 years was a long time. People had similar features. This could be coincidence, wishful thinking, the cruelest trick her desperate mind could play. But the scar. That specific scar in that specific place. She drove home going 20 miles over the speed limit, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might be having a cardiac event. Robert was in the garage, working on an old tractor engine he'd been restoring to keep his hands busy. Catherine burst through the door, the flyer clutched in her fist like a winning lottery ticket. Robert. Her voice came out strangled. Robert, look at this. He straightened up, wiping grease from his hands, seeing the wildness in her eyes. Kath, what's wrong? She thrust the flyer at him. Look at him. And the one on the right. Look at the scar. Robert took the paper, squinting at it, then moving to better light. Catherine watched his face, watched the color drain from it, watched his hands begin to tremble just as hers had. That's not, he started, then stopped. It can't be. The scar, Robert. The bike accident. You remember? And lots of people have scars. Not like that. Not in that exact spot. Catherine was crying now, tears streaming down her face. It's him. I know it's him. I know my son. Robert set the flyer down on the workbench, his movements slow and careful, as if the paper might shatter. The recovery center. Where is it? Catherine flipped the flyer over. An address in Harrisburg, about 90 minutes away. The open house was in 2 days. They didn't sleep that night. They couldn't. They sat at the kitchen table, the flyer between them, barely speaking, both afraid to hope and unable to stop hoping. At some point near dawn, Robert made coffee. Catherine called Detective Torres, now retired, who'd left her personal number years ago with instructions to call if anything ever came up. Torres answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. Catherine explained everything in a rush, the flyer, the photo, the scar. And Torres was quiet for a long moment. Catherine, she said gently, I need you to prepare yourself for this not being him. That the mind can play tricks, especially when we want something so badly. I know my son, Catherine repeated. Come with us. Please. You will see. Torres agreed, partly because she'd never been able to let the case go entirely, and partly because she heard something in Catherine's voice that made her think maybe, just maybe, this was real. Saturday arrived with the slow inevitability of a storm on the horizon. Robert and Catherine left at 7 in the morning, Torres meeting them at a rest stop halfway to Harrisburg. The three of them rode together in Torres's sedan, the conversation sparse and tense. Torres had made calls, pulled strings, gotten a contact name at the recovery center. They weren't going in blind, but they were going in scared. New Beginnings Recovery Center occupied a converted warehouse in a rough neighborhood on Harrisburg's south side. The building had been renovated, painted a hopeful yellow, but the surrounding area spoke of poverty and struggle. Chain-link fences, boarded-up windows. They're the kind of place where people ended up when they'd run out of other options. The open house was already underway when they arrived at 11. Tables set up with pamphlets and coffee. A dozen or so people milling around, some clearly residents of the program, others supporters or family members. A woman in her 40s with kind eyes, and a name tag reading Director Patricia Walsh greeted them at the door. Torres showed her badge, retired but still impressive, and asked to speak privately. Walsh's expression shifted from welcoming to guarded, but she led them to a small office off the main room. Catherine clutched Robert's hand hard enough to hurt. Her eyes were scanning every face in the building, searching for the one from the photograph. In the office, Torres explained the situation as delicately as possible. A missing child case, now 20 years old. A possible identification based on a photograph. Walsh listened, her expression growing more concerned. The man in the photo, Walsh said slowly. His name is Thomas Reed. He's been with our program for 6 months. He came to us from the streets, severe addiction issues, no family contact that we are aware of. Thomas Reed, Catherine repeated, the name foreign in her mouth. Can we see him? Talk to him? Walsh hesitated. This is highly unusual, and potentially traumatic for Thomas if this turns out to be a case of mistaken identity. He's in a fragile place right now. Please, Catherine said, and the desperation in that single word could have broken stone. I just need to see him. If it's not him, we will leave. But if it is, if there's any chance, we need to know. Walsh studied Catherine's face for a long moment, then nodded. I will ask Thomas if he's willing to speak with you, but I won't force him, and I will be present during the conversation. She left the office. The wait was excruciating, seconds stretching into hours in Catherine's perception. Robert stood by the window, his back to the room, shoulders rigid. Torres sat calmly, but her hand rested on her phone ready. The door opened. Walsh came back in, followed by a young man, thin, guarded, wearing jeans and a grey sweatshirt. Dark hair, longer than in the photograph. Hollow cheeks. The scar above his left eyebrow. Catherine made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. She stood up so quickly her chair nearly tipped backward. "Look, Daniel?" The young man froze. His eyes, dark and wary, moved between the three people staring at him like he was a ghost. "My name is Thomas," he said. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "I don't know who Daniel is." "Look at me," Catherine said, taking a step forward. Walsh moved slightly, ready to intervene. "Please, just look at me." Thomas met her eyes. For a moment there was nothing. Then something flickered across his face, confusion, maybe recognition, maybe just fear. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know you." "The scar," Robert said from behind them, his voice thick. "How did you get that scar?" Thomas's hand moved unconsciously to his eyebrow, touching the thin line of scar tissue. "I don't remember," he said. "I don't remember a lot from before." "Before when?" Torres asked, her detective instincts kicking in despite her retirement. Thomas looked at Walsh, seeking permission or perhaps rescue. She nodded slightly. "I don't have clear memories before I was about 14, Thomas said. "The doctors think it's trauma-related. Dissociative amnesia, they called it. Everything before that is just fragments, nothing solid." Catherine felt the room spin. "You were 9, she whispered. "When you were taken, you were 9 years old." "Taken?" Thomas repeated, and now there was something in his voice, alarm or maybe curiosity. "What are you talking about?" Torres stepped forward, calm and professional. "Thomas or Daniel, I'm a retired detective. I worked your case for 3 years. You disappeared from Riverside Mall on November 14th, 1998. Your parents have been looking for you ever since." Thomas backed against the wall, his breathing quickening. I don't remember any of that." Walsh put a hand on his shoulder. "Thomas, it's okay. You don't have to do this right now." But Catherine was pulling out her phone, scrolling frantically through photos. "Here," she said, thrusting the screen toward him. "This is you. This is your room. This is your birthday party when you turned 8. Thomas looked at the screen, and his face went pale. The photo showed a boy with brown hair and a gap-toothed smile, wearing a paper party hat, standing in front of a cake shaped like a dinosaur. The resemblance to the man standing in the office was undeniable. Thomas started, then stopped. His hand was trembling as he touched the screen, enlarging the photo. "That room. I have dreamed about that room." The silence that followed was so complete that Catherine could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "You remember?" Robert asked, hope and fear warring in his voice. Thomas shook his head slowly. "Not remember. Not really. But I have had these dreams, the same ones over and over. And a room with dinosaur posters, a red jacket, lights that came from my shoes when I walked." He looked up at Catherine, and his eyes were wide, frightened. "Who am I?" The office at New Beginnings Recovery Center felt smaller with each passing second, as if the walls were contracting around the revelation that hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Thomas Reed or Daniel Holloway or whoever he was stood pressed against the wall, his chest rising and falling rapidly, then his eyes darting between the three strangers who claimed to know his past better than he knew it himself. Patricia Walsh, the director, moved with practiced calm. "Everyone needs to take a breath," she said firmly. "Thomas, you are safe. No one is going to force anything on you." "Catherine, Robert, I understand this is overwhelming, but we need to proceed carefully." Detective Torres pulled out her phone. "I'm going to make some calls. If this is Daniel Holloway, we need to confirm it properly. DNA testing, dental records if they still exist. This needs to be done right." Catherine couldn't stop staring at the young man before her, cataloging every detail. The way he stood with his weight on his left foot, just like Daniel used to. The way his left hand fidgeted when he was nervous, thumb rubbing against his fingers in a repetitive pattern she'd seen 1,000 times when he was anxious about tests or thunderstorms. These weren't things you could fake, weren't things that appeared in photographs. "Can we talk?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just talk." You don't have to remember anything. I just want to hear about your life. Thomas looked at Walsh, who nodded slowly. I will stay, Walsh said. And we keep this short. It's 20 minutes. Then Thomas needs space to process. They moved to a larger room, a common area with worn couches and motivational posters on the walls. Through the windows, Catherine could see other residents of the recovery center going about their day, unaware that in this room, a mystery 2 decades old was unraveling. Thomas sat in a chair, not on the couch where Catherine and Robert had settled. Distance, he needed distance. Torres remained standing, observing her decades of interview experience, reading every micro-expression, every shift in body language. Tell us about yourself, Robert said. His voice was steadier than Catherine expected. Whatever you are comfortable sharing. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on his hands. When he spoke, his voice was flat, rehearsed, like he'd told this story before in therapy sessions. My earliest clear memory is being in a house. I don't know where, somewhere rural, I think. There was a man who I called Dad, but he wasn't. He couldn't have been my real father. I know that now, but as a kid, it's what I knew. Catherine's hands clenched in her lap. Robert reached over, taking one of her hands in his. He kept me isolated, Thomas continued. Homeschooled, he said, but it wasn't really school. Basic reading and math. Mostly I did chores, fixed things around the property. There were rules, a lot of rules. Don't go near the road. Don't talk to people if we went into town. Don't ask questions about before. That before, Torres repeated softly. He acknowledged there was a before. Thomas nodded. None. Sometimes he'd say things like, your old life is gone, or you are safe now from the bad people. He made it sound like he'd rescued me from something terrible. For years I believed him. I had fragments of memories, dreams maybe. But they didn't make sense. A mall, lots of people, being scared. He told me those were nightmares, not real memories. Catherine pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting the urge to scream, to cry, to rage at the universe for the cruelty of what she was hearing. How long were you with him? Robert asked. 5 years, I think. Maybe 6. Time was strange there. Then one day he just didn't come home. I waited for 3 days before I left the house. I was maybe 14, 15. I didn't know what else to do, so I walked to the nearest town. Ended up in the foster system after that. Torres leaned forward slightly. Do you remember the man's name? What he looked like? Where this house was? Thomas shook his head. I have tried. In therapy, they have tried to help me remember. It's all fog. Like trying to see through frosted glass. I know he was tall. I know the house was white with green shutters. I know there was a barn that was falling apart. But names, locations, it's all gone. In the foster system, Torres continued. There would be records. How did you end up in the system with no identification, no history? They gave me a new identity, Thomas said. Thomas Reed. I told them I didn't remember my real name, didn't remember anything before the house. They tried to find out who I was, ran fingerprints, checked missing children databases. But nothing came up. Eventually they just created paperwork for me. Happened more than you'd think with kids who have been trafficked or hidden. And the word trafficked hit Catherine like a physical blow. The implications of what Daniel had endured for those missing years crashed over her in waves. After foster care, Robert prompted, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. But Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. I aged out at 18 with nothing. Bounced around, bad jobs, bad decisions, started using to quiet the dreams, the fragments of memory that wouldn't leave me alone. I've been in and out of programs like this for years. This is actually the longest I have been clean. 7 months now. Walsh spoke up. Thomas has been doing excellent work here, but he's one of our success stories in progress. Catherine finally found her voice again. The dreams you mentioned. The room with dinosaur posters. What else do you dream about? Thomas closed his eyes. A woman with brown hair, always worried, always checking on me. A man with rough hands but a gentle voice. Singing sometimes. Someone singing me to sleep. His eyes opened, finding Catherine's. Was that you? Tears streamed freely down Catherine's face now. Yes, she managed. Every night. You had trouble sleeping. I'd sing You Are My Sunshine. Every single night. Thomas stood abruptly, pacing to the window. His shoulders were shaking. Walsh moved toward him, but he held up a hand, stopping her. I need to know, he said, his voice breaking. I need to know if this is real, if you are real. Because if you are, if I really had parents who loved me, who looked for me, then everything I thought about my life is wrong. It's real, Robert said, standing as well. Well, we never stopped looking, never stopped hoping. Your room is exactly as you left it. We kept everything, just in case. Torres cleared her throat. I have made the calls. We can have DNA testing done as early as tomorrow. The old case file has your original birth records, and we kept biological samples from your childhood. A cheek swab from Thomas will give us definitive answers within 48 hours. Thomas turned from the window. His face was wet with tears. He didn't seem aware he was crying. And if it matches? If I'm really Daniel Holloway? Then what? What? It was the question no one had an answer for. 20 years stolen. A childhood erased, and parents who were strangers. A life built on lies and trauma and fragmented memories. Catherine stood slowly, approaching Thomas like he was a wounded animal that might bolt. Then we figure it out, she said. Together. No pressure, no expectations. Just the truth, finally. But Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment Catherine saw her son, her 9-year-old boy, staring out from behind the eyes of this damaged young man. I'm scared, he whispered. Me too, Catherine whispered back. The DNA test was conducted the next morning at a police lab Torres had connections with. A simple cheek swab from Thomas, compared against the samples kept in the case file. And the technician promised results as quickly as possible, understanding the weight of what this meant. The waiting period was agony. Catherine and Robert checked into a hotel in Harrisburg, unable to drive home, unable to be more than a few miles away from the recovery center. Torres stayed with them, partly for support, partly because after 20 years she needed to see this through. Thomas remained at the center, but Walsh reported that he was struggling, not using but withdrawn, attending his group sessions but barely participating. The possibility of having his entire identity rewritten was taking its toll. On the second day, Torres's phone rang at 3 in the afternoon. She answered, listened, her face carefully neutral. When she hung up, she looked at Catherine and Robert. It's a match, she said simply. Thomas Reed is Daniel Holloway. 99.9% certainty. Catherine collapsed into Robert's arms, 20 years of grief and hope and desperate prayers releasing in great, shaking sobs. Robert held her, his own tears silent but steady, his face buried in her hair. Torres stepped away, giving them privacy, but Catherine could see her wiping her eyes as well. Even for a hardened detective, this was overwhelming. The challenge now was what came next. The case, dormant for so long, was suddenly active again. Who had taken Daniel? Where had he been kept? What had happened to his abductor? These questions needed answers, and Thomas held the only clues, locked behind walls of trauma and dissociative amnesia. The FBI was brought in. Agent Marcus Vance, a specialist in child abduction cases, arrived from Pittsburgh. He was younger than Torres, maybe early 40s, with the kind of intensity that suggested he took every case personally. We need to approach this carefully, Vance explained in a meeting with Torres, the Holloways and Walsh. Thomas wasn't present, not yet ready for the full weight of the investigation. Recovered memories can be unreliable, and pushing too hard can actually create false memories or further traumatize the victim. Daniel, Catherine corrected. His name is Daniel. Vance nodded. Daniel. The key is going to be finding corroborating evidence. The house he described. property records, missing persons reports on the abductor if he's deceased as Daniel believes. We work backward from what we know. Over the following weeks, a picture began to emerge. Using geographical profiling and Thomas's, Daniel's fragmentary memories of the landscape, investigators narrowed down possible locations. Rural Pennsylvania, within a certain radius of where Daniel had been found by authorities at 14. White house, green shutters, falling down barn. It was a social worker pulling old files who found the connection. A boy, no name, no identification, had been brought into the foster system in 2004 from a small town called Garrett, population 300, in the mountains of central Pennsylvania. The responding officer's report mentioned finding the boy walking along Route 36, dehydrated and confused. Garrett was 2 hours from where Daniel had disappeared, deep in state game lands and dying coal country. Investigators descended on the town, showing photos of Daniel, asking about abandoned properties, about men who kept to themselves. An elderly woman at the local general store remembered something. There was a man lived out on the old Pritchard place, had kept to himself. Haven't seen him in years, must be 15 years now. Just stopped coming into town. Figured he died or moved on. The Pritchard place was 6 miles outside of town, accessible only by a rutted dirt road that wound through thick forest. The police and FBI went in with a warrant, though no one had lived there for over a decade. The house was white. The shutters, what remained of them, were green. The barn was a skeleton of rotted wood, half collapsed. Inside the house, they found a nightmare preserved in dust and decay. The small bedroom, barely large enough for a twin bed, with a lock on the outside of the door. Textbooks from the 1980s, homeschool curriculum, photographs on a mantel, a family that wasn't real. The abductor and Daniel posed together in settings that suggested normalcy but held only horror. And in a desk drawer, a driver's license belonging to Harold Pritchard, born 1952. The photo showing a tall man with thinning hair and eyes that held nothing but emptiness. Horrors, present for the search, found something else. A folder, hidden in a false bottom of a closet. Inside were newspaper clippings, all about missing children, dozens of them, spanning decades. Daniel's case was there, a yellowed article from 1998 with his school photo. But Daniel was the only one who'd survived long enough to escape. Forensic teams began the grim work of searching the property for remains. The barn, the woods, the overgrown fields. What they found would eventually lead to the closure of 7 cold cases, 7 children who never made it home. Daniel had been lucky, if such a word could be used. Harold Pritchard had died, probably of a heart attack or stroke, leaving Daniel alive but alone. The others hadn't had that chance. When Torres told Catherine and Robert what they'd found, the relief that Daniel was alive warred with the horror of understanding how close they'd come to losing him forever. And the knowledge that 7 other families had lost their children to the same monster added a layer of grief that was almost unbearable. Daniel, when told about the findings, shut down completely. He stopped talking, stopped engaging. The reality of what he'd survived, what he'd been part of even unknowingly, was too much. Walsh and a team of trauma specialists worked with him intensively, helping him process not just the recovered memories but the new information about his abduction. The media frenzy was intense. The miracle reunion, the decades-long mystery solved, the discovery of a serial child predator. Catherine and Robert did one interview, one press conference, pleading for privacy as their family healed. Then they retreated, taking Daniel back to the farmhouse outside Millerton. It was strange having him home. He was Daniel genetically, factually, but he was also Thomas, the person he'd become through trauma and survival. He spent hours in his childhood bedroom, touching things, trying to trigger memories. Some came back, small things. The feel of his favorite stuffed dinosaur. The way sunlight came through the window in the morning. And the smell of Catherine's cooking. But larger memories remained elusive. A day at the mall. The abduction itself, the first years with Pritchard. His mind had locked those away, perhaps permanently, a mercy of the human brain's ability to protect itself. Therapy became a central part of Daniel's life. working through complex PTSD, addiction issues, attachment disorder. Learning to trust, to feel safe, to understand that Catherine and Robert weren't going to disappear. It was slow, painful work. 6 months after the reunion, on a Sunday morning, Catherine was making breakfast. Daniel came down the stairs, and she noticed he was carrying something. The red windbreaker, the one he'd worn that day, preserved in his closet all these years. "I remember this," he said quietly. "Not wearing it, but I remember wanting to wear it. I remember thinking it made me look cool." Catherine set down the spatula, turning to face him fully. "I remember you," Daniel continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Not everything, not most things. But I remember feeling safe with you. I remember being loved." Catherine crossed the kitchen, pulling him into an embrace. He was taller than her now, broader, a man grown. But in that moment she felt like she was holding her 9-year-old son, the one who'd been ripped away on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. "You are loved," she whispered. "You always were. You always will be." None. Robert appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene. He joined the embrace, the three of them holding each other in the morning light of the kitchen, a family reunited by chance and a mother's unshakable recognition of her child. The recovery wasn't linear. There were setbacks, days when Daniel couldn't get out of bed, days when the weight of lost years was crushing. There were fights, misunderstandings, moments when the gap between who Daniel had been and who Thomas had become seemed unbridgeable. But there were also breakthroughs. The first time Daniel laughed, really laughed, at something Robert said. The first time he called Catherine Mom without prompting. The day he planted a garden in the backyard, his hands in the soil, grounding himself in the present. A year after the reunion, Detective Torres visited. She was working on a book about the case, with Daniel's permission, hoping to help other families of missing children. They sat on the porch, drinking lemonade, watching the sun set over the fields. "Do you ever think about the what-ifs?" Torres asked. "What if Catherine hadn't seen that flyer? What if you'd never ended up at that recovery center?" Daniel considered this. "Every day," he admitted. "But I try not to stay there. I'm here now, and that has to be enough." Torres nodded. "You know, in 20 years of working cases, yours is the only one that ended like this. The only miracle I ever witnessed." "It doesn't feel like a miracle," Daniel said. "It feels like survival." "Maybe that's what miracles really are," Torres replied. The legal proceedings took years. Pritchard was dead, but his estate was sued, the proceeds going to the families of his victims. Daniel waived his portion, asking that it be divided among the other families. He didn't want money that came from that place, from those years. Catherine and Robert never asked Daniel for details about his time with Pritchard unless he volunteered them. They understood that some doors were better left closed, some memories better left buried. What mattered was moving forward, building a present and future that could coexist with the past without being consumed by it. By 2021, Daniel had been home for 2 years. He'd completed his JED, was taking classes at community college, studying social work. He wanted to help others who'd been through trauma, who'd lost pieces of themselves and needed to find a way back. He was dating someone, a woman named Lisa, who worked at the library and understood that healing wasn't linear, that some days were harder than others. Catherine liked her, appreciated how she gave Daniel space to be whoever he was on any given day. One evening, Daniel asked Catherine and Robert to sit with him. He had something he needed to say. "I have been thinking," he started, his hands fidgeting in that old familiar pattern, "about my name. Thomas Reed was someone I had to be to survive. Daniel Holloway is who I was before. But I'm not really either of those people anymore." Catherine felt a flutter of panic. After fighting so hard to get him back, was he going to disappear again into a new identity? "I want to be Daniel," he continued, "but I need to acknowledge Thomas too. He kept me alive. He got me through. So I'm thinking Daniel Thomas Holloway. All of it. All of me." Robert smiled, understanding in a way that Catherine was still processing. That sounds exactly right, he said. Catherine reached over, taking Daniel's hand. Daniel Thomas Holloway, she repeated. It's perfect. And the case officially closed in 2022. All of Pritchard's victims identified, families notified, the monster's property sold and razed to the ground. A memorial was erected in Garrett, a small stone marker with the names of the children who'd been taken. Daniel attended the dedication, standing with the families who'd lost so much. He spoke briefly, his voice steady. We can't change what happened. We can't bring back the ones we lost. But we can remember them. We can make sure their names aren't forgotten. And we can keep fighting to bring other missing children home. And the Holloway case became a touchstone in the missing children advocacy community. It proved that even after decades, recovery was possible. It showed the importance of never giving up, of keeping cases active, of continuing to search. But for Catherine, Robert, and Daniel, it was simpler than that. It was about a family torn apart and stitched back together, imperfectly but genuinely. It was about a mother who knew her son's face even after 20 years. It was about a father who never stopped hoping. It was about a boy who survived the unsurvivable and found his way home. On November 14, 2024, the 26th anniversary of Daniel's abduction, the family gathered at the farmhouse, not to mourn as they had for so many years, but to celebrate, to acknowledge the pain and the loss, but also the reunion and the healing. Daniel stood in his childhood bedroom, now a guest room, but still containing pieces of who he'd been. Catherine appeared in the doorway, watching him. "You okay?" she asked. Daniel turned, a genuine smile on his face. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I really am." Outside, night was falling over the Pennsylvania farmland. Somewhere, other families were still searching, still hoping, still waiting for their own miracles. The Holloways knew that pain intimately, knew the weight of years without answers. But they also knew the impossible joy of recovery, the overwhelming relief of a mystery solved, of a child found. It didn't erase the lost decades. It didn't heal every wound. But it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. "No, which'll do,"